And again, when you're doing this in real time, the whole thing takes maybe 3 breaths. But some of the research on this particular breathing technique shows that it does a couple of things. So one of the things it does is it can help balance the nervous system in a way that increases vagal activity or vagal tone or RSA, things that we know are an index of a balanced nervous system that leaves you ready to engage, including engage with challenges, but in a way that's relatively centered and grounded. So you're bringing your best self through your autonomic nervous system to whatever challenges await. This meditation has also been shown to increase positive emotions like hope and social connectedness that can also be real resources for not just the challenges of healthcare, but of course for any interaction or any moment that you're entering, any moment that matters. But let's talk a little about what's happening in the brain during compassion, because I often actually walk people in my classes through, I don't have the schematic of it or any fMRI data to show you, but I often walk people through the different regions of the brain that seem to be activated and co-activated. It really helps people understand how complex and what an unfolding process compassion is. So, and I'll do this in sort of a very in a loose sketch way rather than getting too deep into it. But one of the first things that happens when people experience what we would describe as compassion, which I haven't even defined yet, but I would define as being aware of suffering, being moved or touched by that suffering in a way that gives rise to the desire to relieve that suffering, which is joined by a sense that there's something you can do. So you choose to engage, and hopefully you feel a kind of a warm glow at your decision to engage. And sometimes that's characterized by a sense of satisfaction after you help someone. Sometimes it's characterized by a sense of connection to the person that you are trying to help. Sometimes it's characterized by a sense of affirming your own values. So even if you try to relieve the suffering, but there's nothing you could do in that moment to take away someone's pain, you can still feel a warm glow. It doesn't have to come from actually fixing a problem. It can come from affirming your values and feeling connected to the person that you are trying to help. So that's compassion. And often it starts in the brain. It looks a lot like a stress response often. The first signature you'll see is activation of perhaps the amygdala, perhaps areas of the brain associated with vicarious pain, areas like the insula, areas like the anterior cingulate cortex, areas of the brain that basically say, this is a moment that matters and something is at stake. And often when we notice that it is suffering, it activates areas of the brain. It's not just this is a moment that matters, but this is a moment of distress, or this is a moment of threat, or whatever the quality is, a moment of sadness. So you see that almost contagious stress or contagious pain or contagious sadness be activated in the brain. That's one of the very first things that happens. And too often people get overwhelmed by that. They're like, did not want to catch other people's stress, and they start to regulate, not to use that as a catalyst for something good, but they try to regulate it down, to suppress it. And that's where you'll see people distancing themselves or literally leaving the room or putting on their psychological armor or getting drunk. I mean, there's a lot of things people can do to try to downregulate that. But when you watch compassion unfold, and by the way, when people are probably like, where is this research coming from? You may have already heard this in this entire series, but some of this research comes from taking people who've dedicated their lives to training in compassion meditation and asking them to do compassion in their minds and see what happens. It also comes from training ordinary citizens in trying to cultivate compassion and then looking at what changes in their brains as they are confronted with suffering once they have actually worked on developing compassion. It comes from studies looking at people who haven't been trained at all and simply are reporting that they're feeling great compassion. So is it, a lot of interesting resources where what happens in the brain comes from. Okay, so we've got the sympathetic stress. And then what comes on next is often social cognition, the part of the brain that thinks about somebody else's experience. And what's really key about this is that we often talk about compassion as a merging of self with other, but the social cognition actually often puts some boundaries around it. So you become very aware that you are reflecting on and responding to someone else's suffering. This is not your suffering, which is what it can feel like in that first moment of sympathetic distress. And so the areas of social cognition, which midline structures of the brain and the side of the cortex and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, areas of the brain that basically allow you to think about other people's experiences and understand yourself as related to, but also distinct from that other. Seems to be really important for having this balanced approach so that you don't feel completely overwhelmed by the suffering that you're confronted with, and you don't fall into this sort of downward spiral of now I'm suffering, and now I'm scared, and now I'm sad, and now I just need to escape all the suffering. It's mine now. And then what you start to see unfolding next is the reward system, or what's typically described as the reward system, areas deep in the midbrain, areas like the ventral tegmental area, areas that produce and release dopamine and send it through to the frontal parts of the brain to get you to feel hopeful and to activate the approach motivation system of the brain. So the idea is that you have the sense that I want to get closer to whatever's triggering this brain activation. And it's what leads people to have courage in the face of suffering, or it's what leads people to become caregivers when they see someone in distress. It's that instinct that says something good is going to happen if I help, if I hug, if I stay put instead of run away. And those are the three main systems that you see becoming engaged during the unfolding process of compassion.